In the rolling hills of Kentucky, where 95% of the world's bourbon is born, a disturbing silence has started to settle. For generations, the sweet smell of fermenting mash and the hum of distilleries has been the heartbeat of this state. We're talking about a $9 billion industry, a signature part of Kentucky's identity. But over the past year, that heartbeat has gotten faint. The pulse of this iconic American industry is fading. What started as a trade dispute, political posturing some called it, has spiraled into an economic catastrophe. This isn't just a story about a market downturn, it's a story about a shutdown. It's about how America's second biggest customer, its closest neighbor, just decided to turn off the tap. And in doing so, they may have permanently crippled the American bourbon industry. In early 2025, the American whiskey market was on top of the world. Exports were booming, and Canada was a reliable partner, to the tune of hundreds of millions of dollars. 1 year later, that market has been decimated. Exports to Canada plummeted by a staggering 70%. A massive revenue stream, worth nearly $250 million, simply vanished. This wasn't a slow decline. It was a targeted, surgical strike. It was a complete delisting of products from shelves, an action the CEO of the company that makes Jack Daniels called worse than a tariff, because it's literally taking your sales away. Major brands are now facing unimaginable losses, distilleries have had to cut production, and a political feud has revealed a truth that no one in the American liquor industry wants to admit. They were completely and devastatingly outplayed. This is the story of how Canada brought Kentucky's signature industry to its knees. Section 1. The Catalyst. A shot fired across the border. So how did we get here? Well, as you might have guessed, it all started with politics. In early 2025, in a move to protect domestic industries, the United States government announced sweeping new tariffs on Canadian goods, citing national security concerns. Now, this wasn't the first trade skirmish between the two neighbors, but the scale and the tone just felt different. The tariffs targeted foundational Canadian industries, and the response from north of the border was going to be just as pointed. For decades, spirits had flowed between the U.S. and Canada with zero tariffs. It was a stable, mutually beneficial relationship that saw trade in spirits boom by over 147% since the 1990s. The American bourbon industry, a powerhouse that produces almost all of the world's supply, saw Canada as its second largest and most reliable export market. Annually, hundreds of millions of dollars worth of American spirits, mostly Kentucky bourbon, made its way to Canadian consumers. The industry thrives in a zero-for-zero tariff environment, as Chris Swanger, the CEO of the Distilled Spirits Council, has said time and time again. The American tariffs shattered that environment. Canada saw the move not just as an economic measure, but as an aggressive jab from an ally. The response, therefore, couldn't just be economic. It had to be political. It had to be symbolic. And what's more symbolic of America, especially states like Kentucky, than its native spirit, bourbon? Canadian officials, looking to apply maximum political pressure, put American whiskey squarely in their crosshairs. But a simple retaliatory tariff was just the opening shot. The real damage, the move that nobody in Kentucky saw coming, was far more brutal. Canada's retaliation was swift, coordinated, and devastatingly effective. It exploited a unique feature of the Canadian liquor market, provincially run liquor control boards. See, in most of Canada, the government is the largest, and often only, buyer and seller of alcohol. Crown corporations like the LCBO in Ontario and the SAQ in Quebec hold a monopoly on sales. If they decide not to stock your product, you don't just lose market share, you lose the entire market. You just cease to exist there. And that's exactly what happened. The first major blow came on March 4, 2025. Ontario's Premier Doug Ford was blunt, with reports saying he personally told Kentucky's governor they were going after their bourbon and that they're done, they're gone. The Liquor Control Board of Ontario, the LCBO, which sells nearly $1 billion worth of American alcohol annually, was ordered to stop all imports and sales. They began stripping over 3,600 U.S. products from their catalog and shelves. And since the LCBO is the exclusive wholesaler, that meant bars, restaurants, and private retailers couldn't restock any American spirits. One by one, other provinces followed. Quebec, New Brunswick, British Columbia, and Nova Scotia all directed their government-run retailers to pull American products. Signs that once featured iconic American brands appeared in liquor stores, now reading, "Buy Canadian instead." It was a nationwide blackout. This wasn't a tariff that made bourbon more expensive, it was a ban that made it disappear. Lawson Whiting, the CEO of Brown-Forman, which owns Jack Daniel's and Woodford Reserve, captured the industry's shock. Completely removing our products from the shelves, that's a very disproportionate response to a 25% tariff. He was right. You can absorb a tariff or pass it on to the customer. You can't sell a product that isn't there. The effect was immediate. In the months following the ban, American spirit exports to Canada didn't just decline, they collapsed. Sales plummeted. Exports that stood at $238 million the previous year fell to just $89 million. Canada, once the industry's number 2 market, fell to 6th place. The fallout from Canada's decision landed with seismic force in Kentucky. The bourbon industry isn't just another business in the bluegrass state. It's a pillar of the economy, a cultural touchstone, a way of life. It's a $9 billion industry responsible for over 23,000 jobs. So when Canada shut the door, it wasn't just distillery shareholders who felt the pain, it was everyone. The numbers tell a story of pure economic devastation. With its largest export market effectively gone overnight, distilleries faced an impossible situation. Think about a family-owned operation like Michter's Distillery in Louisville. Suddenly, they were looking at huge orders, already bottled and labeled in English and French specifically for Canada, just sitting in their warehouse with nowhere to go. For the giants of the industry, the scale was even bigger. Brown-Forman reported that its sales to Canada plunged 59% in the 9 months leading up to January 2026. The problem with making bourbon is that it's a bet on the future. You distill a product today that won't be ready to sell for 5, 10, sometimes 20 years. Distillers basically operate with a crystal ball, trying to predict the market years down the line. Kentucky distilleries were sitting on a record 16 million barrels of aging bourbon, an inventory built on the assumption of stable, growing markets. Suddenly, that assumption was shattered. The situation grew so dire that even a giant like Jim Beam announced it would shutter its main distillery for all of 2026 due to the sales slump. The ripple effect hit every corner of the Kentucky economy. Farmers growing the specific corn and rye for the mash bills saw contracts canceled. Coopers, the skilled artisans who craft the charred white oak barrels essential for bourbon's flavor, saw a sharp drop in orders. Truckers, glass manufacturers, label printers, all of them felt the hit. A global trade dispute had become a local catastrophe, turning off the lights in small-town Kentucky. Maybe the most devastating part of this story for American distillers is what happened next in Canada. That shelf space, once occupied by Jim Beam, Wild Turkey, and Uncle Nearest, didn't just sit empty. And the demand from Canadian consumers didn't just evaporate. It pivoted. Freed from the shadow of its giant American neighbor, the Canadian whiskey industry surged to fill the void. And this wasn't just a business opportunity, it felt like a national movement. Those "Buy Canadian instead" signs were more than a suggestion. They became a rallying cry. Consumers, feeling slighted by the American tariffs, consciously chose to support their own. The results were stunning. In Quebec, between March 2025 and January 2026, sales of locally produced whiskey shot up by an incredible 114%. One Montreal distillery said their whiskey production more than doubled. Across the country, it was the same story. As American whiskey sales in bars and restaurants plunged, Canadian whiskey sales rose. Before the dispute, their market shares were nearly identical. Afterward, Canadian whiskey captured 40% of the volume share in bars and restaurants, compared to American whiskey's 25%. And this gets to the brutal reality of the retail world. Shelf space and consumer loyalty are incredibly hard to win, and once you lose them, they're nearly impossible to get back. Canadian distillers, who'd long competed with the massive marketing budgets of American giants, were suddenly handed a protected market. They started innovating, releasing new products, and capturing a new generation of drinkers now developing a taste for local spirits. Even if the trade dispute were resolved tomorrow, American brands couldn't just reclaim their old spots. They'd have to fight a battle against newly emboldened Canadian competitors, who now have a loyal customer base. The market wasn't paused. It was being actively reconquered by domestic forces. While Canada did eventually lift its retaliatory tariff in the fall of 2025, the real weapon, the delisting from provincial stores, remained largely in effect. The political damage outlasted the economic one. For most of Canada, American whiskey is still gone from the shelves. This crisis is a brutal cautionary tale about the unintended consequences of trade wars. Bourbon, a uniquely American product that can't just be made somewhere else to avoid tariffs, became an easy and high-profile target, and the damage extends beyond Canada. This dispute created a playbook for other nations. The European Union has also threatened tariffs, and the industry now lives in a state of constant uncertainty. For the smaller craft producers, who don't have the massive cash reserves of global companies, losing a major export market like Canada isn't a setback, it's an existential threat. The long-term impact is chilling. Has consumer preference in Canada shifted for good? After spending over a year exploring their own domestic whiskeys, will they ever fully return to bourbon? The relationships between American distillers and their Canadian partners, built over decades, have been severely strained. Trust is broken. The empty shelves in Ontario, the silent stills in Kentucky, and the booming sales of Canadian whiskey all point to a grim verdict. This wasn't a temporary spat. It was a fundamental reordering of one of the world's most important whiskey markets. The American bourbon industry didn't just lose a customer, it lost its footing, its reputation for stability, and a massive revenue stream that is now fueling its direct competitors. The question that remains is not whether the damage was severe, but whether it's permanent. Is this the end of an era for American bourbon's global dominance, or can the industry claw its way back? What do you think? Has Canada's bold move permanently altered your own buying habits? Let us know in the comments. And if you want to keep understanding the powerful economic forces reshaping our world in unexpected ways, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell. From the fields of Kentucky to the liquor stores of Quebec, this trade war has left a trail of economic wreckage. This whole disaster is a stark reminder that in our globalized world, a single political decision can bring a multi-billion-dollar heritage industry to its knees. For the thousands of Americans whose livelihoods depend on bourbon, the farmers, the coopers, the truckers, the distillery workers, the future remains deeply uncertain. They're left to navigate the fallout of a conflict they didn't start, hoping to repair the damage before it's too late. But with Canadian consumers discovering a love for their own products, the path back for American bourbon looks longer and harder than ever. It may be a path that has been lost for good.